change in pressure. When pressure goes up sharply, sends messages to several parts of the brain. If you tease out all of the sensory fibers, some of them go to the deepest part of the brain, which is our center of inhibition. And what the center of inhibition essentially does is it prevents you from recruiting the biggest motor units. And so the messages basically are sent to disinhibit, to allow you to recruit greater numbers of larger motor units. It's pretty intuitive. When you go home tonight, you get a couple scoops of vanilla. You see way back in the refrigerator that there's a jar of chocolate sauce that everybody's forgotten about for the last 3 years. You go in there, grab that, and you try to take the top off. What do you do instinctively? You hold your breath so you can generate more force. And so this isn't new. Now, why do they tell you in weightlifting, blow the bar up? That's so you modulate the intracranial pressure so you reduce the likelihood of having a blowout. It's a safety thing. It's not having anything to do with performance. Now, what else happens when you've got that jar on there and you're too stubborn to run it under hot water or whack it with a knife? A lot of times in holding your breath, you also clench your teeth. And so what ends up happening is you jam the mandible up into that joint. That joint has special receptors in it that will actually switch your nervous system off. And so why you've seen over time people using custom fit what look like mouth guards in order to keep their jaw neutral and therefore not short circuit the nervous system by clenching their teeth. And so coming out of the blocks, exploding out of the blocks, for pure acceleration, that's about 15 meters, and the breath is in. The whole concept is push, 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 just like you're trying to push a car out of the mud or out of the snow. And we focus on hip extension relative to force production. This is the race model. Now we're going to talk about teaching the start and teaching acceleration, and we may focus on different things in addition to the hip extension motor pattern. The breath comes out, it'll come back in again, don't worry. That we've arbitrarily assigned about 5 meters. And so from 20 to about 40 meters, we want to continue to drive, and what drive means is continue to extend from the hip and continue to apply force by pushing, but you're going to get taller. Now, tall basically is how high is your head off the ground. So in one of our Velocity Sports Performance Centers, one of the sports performance directors basically put a line at about 40 degrees, the length of someone's body, right next to the sprint track. And at the right intervals, he changed the angle of the line until you got out around 30 meters and the line was pretty vertical. What this illustrated was the progression of the power line, or the line that if you drew it from the ankle through the knee, up through the hip and out through the shoulder, that angle changes as velocity increases until you reach zero acceleration, zero mean acceleration, or your maximum velocity, and at that point your body is pretty vertical. So this illustrates the two phases in terms of the race model, and we can put those together. Now, how do you practice this? You put cones out. And when you do your training, so for example, we rarely do starts to 10 meters. Why? They haven't gotten through the first pure acceleration phase. And so we're going to go basically to 20 meters, and they're going to have another cone, a double cone, which signifies their breath has to come out. They're going to stop at 20 meters after their breath comes back in again. Or we'll go out to 40 meters. We rarely, with our athletes, do starts to 30 meters anymore. So it's through the second breath that the athletes are rehearsing that pattern. Isn't it amazing how left uncoached that when you look at young children run, they do a lot of things real well. And then, before they're even coached, they start to get a concept of what running should be like. What should the technique be? And if you talk to my older son who's been around the track a while, he can give you a whole dissertation about the starting blocks. Because he's watched so many times, he has a feeling that he understands kind of how to do it. And so, the key thing that we want to look at are the different phases that we go through in the acceleration phase. We're going to start when the foot leaves the ground. So, wouldn't you agree that the ground, what you do on the ground is most important, right? We've established that. So that's the most important phase. When the foot leaves the ground or at takeoff, this is the point that's the furthest away in the cyclical action, or in acceleration, really it's more of a piston-like action. That's the furthest away from the most important part. So you've got the residual phase, then you've got the recovery phase, the transition phase, ground preparation, and now we're on the ground. So you have the front side phase and then the back side phase. So what we want to try to do is, there's a basic principle in cyclical movement, or that the quality of any phase in the movement is determined by the quality of the phase that immediately precedes it. And so if I want to have a high quality, which means very close to perfect ground phase, I have to have a very close to perfect ground preparation phase. If I want a perfect ground preparation phase, as I'm exploding actively back into the ground with my thigh, I've got to have a good transition phase. So when the thigh blocks and changes direction, that has to be right spot on with the timing. If I want to have a good transition phase, I've got to recover the limb with high quality. And if I want a good recovery phase, I have to have a perfect residual phase. And so if I want to have a perfect residual phase, I have to have a perfect ground phase. It is a cyclical movement, isn't it? And so where we're going to attack changing the motor pattern for the athlete in acceleration is we're going to attack just as the athlete leaves the ground. Now, residual or residue in a glass is something that's left over, isn't it? And so the residual phase, what you notice is the athlete's foot now no longer has contact with the ground, but the thigh continues to go into extension. Is that saving time or wasting time? It's wasting time, because we want to get the thigh from the back of the body to the front of the body as soon as we possibly can. And so what we see is the athlete is pushing, and they continue to push once they've left the ground, but it doesn't generate any force. It's what's left over from the force application against the ground. So we need to be able to recruit. First of all, we need to be able to put the body in the right position so that the muscles are at the right length-tension relationship, so we not only store elastic energy in the muscles, which facilitates recovering the limb, but also we put the muscles in the best length-tension relationship so that when they contract, they generate the greatest force to have the thigh come forward very aggressively. And so, in looking at that, arm action we'll talk about in a minute. We're going to target moving from the ground, getting the thigh to the front. What is the action there? Now, how are we going to transition the thigh? How are we going to prepare the leg to strike the ground? And finally, we're on the ground. Now, Front side phase means from the moment you touch down, the distance from your hip to your foot, that's the front side phase. Mid stance is when your hip is above your foot. Backside phase is when your thigh is behind your body. In acceleration, and this was a bit of a shock to a lot of the biomechanists that were working in the shoe industry. I was working with Nike to help redesign their sprint spikes back in the early 90s. It was called the Superfly project. Had nothing to do with Curtis Mayfield or anything. But I guess I'm too old. My humor is lost on the young. And that the biomechanists, they wanted to see someone come out of the blocks and what was happening at that first landing. So I had one of my athletes with me. He exploded from the blocks, hit the ground, and all of a sudden the biomechanists look at the tracing and they went, "What's this? There's no blip. There's no blip on the screen. You don't see the classic force tracing that you see when you're upright and you're running. There is no front side phase. The athlete lands on the ground with the foot behind the center of mass. If the athlete lands in a front side position, there's no way that they can push. And so the athlete who lands here has to wait. What happens while the athlete's waiting? Everybody else disappears. And so understanding that and having the athlete understand that, it almost feels like you're trying to push behind yourself. Mission statement for our athlete: save a little time on the ground without compromising the force. Save a little time in the air. And this is particularly true in acceleration phase. And so we look at that and we say, well, okay, that's 1/100th of a second per step if we can do that. How many steps in the 100 meters? Not necessarily for the best athletes in the world, but kind of developing athlete. Yeah, about 50. About 50 steps. 1/100th of a second for 50 steps is a half a second. Please introduce me to the sprinter that wouldn't want to improve their time by a half a second. I don't think that there's one out there. But it's reducing the task to the ridiculous for your sprinters so that they understand that by making small positive changes, they're going to have a huge result on their overall performance. So, we had a bit of a discussion yesterday in the hurdles relative to the challenges of changing from an 8-stride to a 7-stride approach for the men's 110-meter hurdles. But one of the ways and again, traditionally, what people have said, I want to take my stronger leg and put that in the front of the blocks. But really, you're wired in a certain particular pattern. Your nervous system is. Part of it is a little bit genetic, and a lot of it is determined by your life experiences. So real quickly, fold your arms on your chest. You're already there. Would you put your left foot back in the blocks? No? Why? You should, because your nervous system says it. So the arm that's closer to your body is probably the leg that should go back in the blocks. Now, we were talking yesterday, Fiekert and I noticed he was left-handed. He said this was a big problem for him when he was growing up because the primary school that he went to forced people to write using their right hand.